This is our 44th webinar. I can't believe it, but it is. And as the title says, with all due respect to Victorinox, or Victorinox, I guess is how you say it, I sort of have thought over the last year or two that one way to think about performance thinking is that it is a Swiss Army knife for performance. And the reason I bring that up is because when I look out there at a variety of different organizational performance improvement methodologies or tools, I recognize that often they're used sort of for narrow applications. For example, in the organizational behavior management world, there's a few applications and tools mostly related to consequences, sometimes to antecedents and feedback, of course. But that's one sort of set of things, and it's used for performance management and things of that sort. And if you look in the human performance technology world, there are typical sets of applications that work very well with complex models and processes in the HPT, human performance technology world. If you look at process improvement or lean process improvement, there's a subset of things, or change management. But what I recognized in thinking about this is, particularly when we look at all the webinars we've done over the last 3.5 years, this is like the Swiss Army knife. It does a lot of things. So before we get into it, I just wanted to remind you, these will all wind up on YouTube. And if you're watching the recording of this, of course, you are watching on YouTube. And you know, we have a whole lot of things there, and you can, by the way, get it on our list for our webinar study guides by pointing your phone at that QR code. And again, if you're online watching, rather, if you're watching the recording, please subscribe and like and share, because it helps us get the word out to more people. Our next month's webinar is going to be about exemplary behavior. And a lot of you probably know about exemplary behavior analysis. You might have been exposed through the work that I've done. You might have read Tom Gilbert, who was really the person who introduced this framework of thinking about what do our top exceptional performers do that make them exceptional. It's not magic. They behave in different ways, usually in small ways. And so we're going to explore that. There's also other folks who have specialized in that area, notably my colleagues Paul Elliott and Al Folsom, who've written a book. I think it's in its second edition now, related to exemplary behavior. We're not going to get deeply into what they do, but I want to talk a little bit about how we integrate exemplary behavior analysis into our work. So here's the agenda for today. As I mentioned, sort of over the years of doing this work, we've discovered an awful lot of applications, and I want to talk about them all in one place, so to speak. And before we do that, I want to, even though I recognize that most of the people here already know about our stuff, I want to provide a really quick overview of the elements of performance thinking and its logic, just so I can refer back to those as we talk about applications. And then something that's become kind of more obvious to me, again, in pretty recently, is that the drive towards simplicity in performance thinking, the efforts that I and my colleagues have made over 25, 30 years now to try to take relatively complex concepts and models about performance improvement and turn them into, as we often say, 21 plain English words and 2 pictures, has not only the benefit of communication effectiveness and collaboration, but a lot of flexibility and power. Because what we started to recognize, and any of those of you who've been through our practitioner program know, that our claim is that basically any kind of performance that involves humans that you can observe or want to improve can be sorted into 6 basic types. And those types are based really on how you go after the accomplishments or the work outputs in your analysis. And so we're going to explore that a little bit, and then give you a whole bunch of examples and sort of different forms of those types. And then add one more thing to sort of not be a spoiler, but about employee engagement, which in many ways overrides all of this. So that's the agenda. And let me just show you this. This is unreadable, of course, but it's I just took a picture of our YouTube channel webinar sections. And we have 4 playlists there. which are basically the years we've been doing this, and we're about halfway or so through the 4th year right now. But this is a lot of stuff. And we started this during COVID, or just at the very beginning, doing these webinars. And what I've come to recognize as I've generated new topics for subsequent webinars is that this is a whole lot of different applications. And out of this will be coming our next phase of our business, which is application kits that I'll mention a little bit toward the end. But what we've realized that this really is a Swiss Army knife, and we've sort of discovered all the ways that we can apply it. But again, as I mentioned, before we dig into that, I want to provide you a hopefully very short overview of performance thinking, just to sort of level set us. I think you probably all know, or most of you are familiar with the fact that this kind of started with Tom Gilbert's influence on me and on thousands of other people in this book that's still taught in graduate programs of in various departments and universities, Human Competence. Tom said a lot of things. He was kind of a brilliant philosopher and thinker. But one of the things that had an enormous impact was the shift from a focus on behavior, which not only behaviorists are focused on, but people who do behavioral objectives for training, leaders, managers, pretty much everybody, he would have described as living in what he called, in that quotation, the cult of behavior. And so what Tom said was, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. I'm reminded, for example, of work that I've done with sales professionals, where there are coaching methodologies that are focused on the behavior of those sales professionals, even though the sales professionals are really trying to produce accomplishments or milestones in the sales process. So the second half of what Tom said was, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, that was a big game changer. And in the field of human performance technology, not just Tom Gilbert, but Gary Rumler and others shifted the focus to the value delivered by people in the form of what they called accomplishments. Now, if you look out into the field of performance improvement, or in OBM or various other areas, you see people using the word accomplishments in a whole lot of different ways. And I kind of became aware of this maybe 10, 15 years ago when I started to realize sometimes people use that word to mean giant, business result kinds of things. And sometimes they mean other stuff. And so there's a whole lot of different levels of sort of chunk size and definitions of accomplishments. And even people who say that any given job should be able to be boiled down to something like 5 to 7 accomplishments. But the approach we've taken is a little more fine-grained than that. And I've not wanted to get in arguments over what the word accomplishments mean, even though it's a great word. So as, again, most of you know, we adopted the, we basically adopted the sort of idea that we would call these things work outputs. So that's our phrase for accomplishments. Now, that's led us to the first of our simple models, the performance chain, which is very straightforward. The way it works is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we call behavior influences, all the things that influence behavior, and they somehow, we hope, support behavior, which is activity, action. And that behavior ideally produces valuable accomplishments or work outputs, which, if they are good, contribute to organizational or business results. So that's a very simple analysis of 4 basic units of analysis in performance. But of course, the focus that Tom Gilbert has emphasized is work outputs. Because although in any project or discussion about performance, we ought to talk about start with the end in mind, which is, why are we doing this again? What's at stake for the organization or the business? But once we know that, once we have some idea about why we're doing it, if it's for revenue or market share or customer satisfaction or employee engagement or whatever, then we say, okay, let's look at the performance. Let's figure out what those work outputs are. And we, as highlighted in the orange, again, some of you who know about our work recognize that we also, once we have identified the work outputs, we make a big deal of saying, what is a good one? What are the criteria for a deliverable, for a relationship, for a decision, for the various kinds of outputs, of which there are many kinds? And that's something we'll come back to. Now, from that, of course, we can then figure out what the behavior is through task analysis or observation, and then we can work on the behavior influences, which, as you know, we have a framework for that as well. But so this is the basic way we analyze performance. And as you'll see, the types of applications that we talk about are pretty much built around how you would go after the work outputs. Now, this is an example of what we would say are work outputs in an individual or role. This is what we call, and we kind of invented this really, the individual performance map. And I think probably all of you are familiar with this, whether you've been through our practitioner program or our coaching program or just watched a whole bunch of these videos. We put the performer or the role in the middle, and we figure out who they deliver value to. And then we list these things that they contribute. And what always kind of blows people's minds when they first look at something like this is that you can put someone's whole job, including a very senior person like a chief learning officer, on a single screen or page. So that's work outputs at the level of the individual. And then we can talk about work outputs within processes. And this is a very simple process for producing a content specification document. But most folks who do process improvement or process documentation put what's listed here in the boxes: behavior, activity, steps, which is not a bad place to start. But once you know what those steps are, you ought to be sure you know what the outputs of each step are that get handed off to the next step or that get given to the next performer, because that's where the value is. And it also, as you'll see when we talk a little bit more about this, is where you can measure and evaluate, figure out what went wrong. Now, we often also show an organizational relationship map, which is a way of looking at a whole organization and all its departments and functions and what the outputs are that get passed around. But most of the projects that I've been involved in or coached have not been at that level, because I mostly work with like global 1,000 companies, and we don't usually get to work with the whole company. So it's usually either roles or processes, and that's where we find the outputs. Now, one of the cool things about all of this is that if you define these elements in the way that we have, which is business results, work outputs, and behavior, but particularly the work outputs, we can count them, because what we say is a work output has to be a countable thing, a countable noun. And as Bob Redeker, who's now retired, but one of my longest serving colleagues and certified to deliver both our coaching program and our practitioner program, said years ago, and I love this quote, he said, if we can get clear with our clients about work outputs and criteria, they can do measurement easily by counting work outputs. So one of the beauties of all of this is that if you think about performance as anchored to work outputs, it's pretty easy, if they're countable things, to measure. And here's some examples, just as some charts of some in a marketing environment. On the left, it's subscribers to a subscription list, and on the right, it's new and active members in a LinkedIn group. And so those are just examples of what work outputs look like when you count them. So we know what the elements of performance are. So what influences the behavior that produces the work outputs? Well, again, most of you probably already know this, but in my history, and I think in the history in general, including with Tom Gilbert, this started out with my teacher and many people's one of heroes, I would say, is Dr. Skinner at Harvard. And his science was based on an analysis of units in what are often called the three-term contingency. So discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses, which are hopefully followed by reinforcing stimuli. And those were functionally defined things. And that means you find out whether it's really a discriminative stimulus by seeing if it changes behavior when presented. You find out if a thing is really a reinforcing consequence by applying it, seeing if the frequency of the behavior increases. Now, this is a little bit nerdy, and so a few years after this started to be documented, people kind of added the plain Englishness of it by saying, well, discriminative stimuli are antecedents, and then there's responses, which are behavior, and then there's reinforcing stimuli, which are consequences. So we had this kind of ABC acronym. But Tom Gilbert recognized that when you move out of the laboratory, it's more complex than that. Because in the laboratory, Dr. Skinner and the many people who've done laboratory research, including myself with humans early in my career, we select ways to respond, what would be called manipulanda or operanda in the laboratory, based on the ease of the organisms to respond. So we use key a key for pigeons. We use a lever for rats. We use a kind of a plunger for humans. And these are things that are built for the individual or for the species, really. But in the world of work, that's not true. We have a lot of different things that we have to interact with as tools. So what Gilbert recognized, and he was a postdoc with Skinner for a while, was that you can take Skinner's framework and you can divide it into the factors that are effective from the environment. That is the information provided by the environment to help you know what you're supposed to accomplish and how you're doing, which are data, he called data. The things which enable you to respond in the environment, and that's the instruments, but that's a lot more than instruments. It's having enough time. It's having resources to help people to help. It means space, software, all kinds of stuff. And incentives or even consequences that you don't know are going to happen, of course, are provided by the environment. So that's the top row. And what we've learned and what Gilbert taught us was that's about 80% of the power of behavior influences. But because we're humans and we're each different and we have different histories, we have different knowledge. And Tom thought about that as sort of information that you carry around with you that functions as an antecedent. And then he used the word capacity to talk about the characteristics of the individual that would allow them to do well using the instruments to produce whatever it was that they were producing, the things that we select people and assign people to jobs with. And then emotives was his way of recognizing what Skinner defined as the functional definition of consequences. That is, you can arrange incentives, but if they don't align with people's motives, they're not going to change their behavior. So we need to understand what is reinforcing, what is punishing, et cetera, for people. So this was Tom's model. And I got turned on to it actually by a mentor of mine, Eric Houghton, and then ultimately spent quite a bit of time with Tom Gilbert, who was sort of a mentor informally to me. And I got real excited about it early in the 80s when I was first working in companies doing fluency-based training and instruction down in the knowledge box. But because what we recognized was that in order to get salespeople and customer service people to actually apply what they were learning on the job, we had to do some things with that top row. We had to expand beyond the knowledge box. But the trouble is, when we started working with our clients, they would get confused by the language, like, what kind of data are you talking about? Or instruments, what does that mean, et cetera. So I spent about 3 or 4 or 5 years tweaking the language. And again, most of you know this, and user testing it until we came up with this. And that's about what I looked like at the time, if you can believe it, back in the late 80s. But this is the 6 boxes model. And so this is the way we frame all the behavior influences that can have an effect on behavior to produce outputs. And most of you know about these categories. It's a system, and that QR code will take you to a webinar entirely devoted to the 6 boxes. But this is the other model, right? So, and in fact, I always share this these days, even though it's not that big a deal, but a few years ago at the International Society for Performance Improvement, when my colleagues arranged a session in which they voted on what's the best performance model in the world, and ours won, So it's not that big a deal. It's a small group, but I think it highlights the fact that it's usable, it's practical, people get it pretty quickly. We can define all the positive stuff in each of those cells. And that can be used for designing or improving performance. We can define what we call obstructions, which are all the negative things that can go wrong in each of the cells. And this is good for root cause analysis or sort of performance problem solving. But it's a complete framework. Now, you got these 2 models. Now what? What do we do with it? You got the 2 pictures, 21 plain English words. How do we use them? Well, many of you know we call that way we use it performance improvement logic. And so we want to start out to be sure we know what's at stake for the business. Once we know that, or the organization, whatever it is, once we know that, we want to say, okay, what's the hunk of performance we're looking at? Is this the performance of an individual or a role or a process or a team? What are the work outputs involved? Because that's the value. And are we sure they contribute to business results? And what does good look like in order for them to contribute to business results? Once we know that, it's relatively a piece of cake, because we can anchor this all in outputs, and that will lead us to the behavior. We can observe people, we can do task analyses, we can capture best practices, but we know what the behavior is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be producing specific work outputs. Once we've done that, we now have the 3 elements of performance we can measure, we can count, et cetera, et cetera. I've already made some reference to that. So now we got a possibility of what's the performance? How might we measure it when we actually implement? So now let's take a look at the behavior influences, and we use the 6 boxes model to analyze what's going on in each of the cells, what's positive, what's negative, what's missing. And then we brainstorm, and we added that maybe 10 years ago as an explicit design thinking component, because we recognize that people often go too quickly to the sort of usual behavior influences, and they don't think robustly about what might be possible. So we strongly encourage managers, leaders, and performance professionals to do some brainstorming about how you could improve those negatives or those things that are missing, in your analysis. And then, ideally, with the stakeholders or the clients, we choose and configure the behavior influences to optimize in the way that we think will optimize performance. But we'll never get it completely right. And this is where the sort of iterative or agile approach comes in, because we then want to implement and measure and decide if it's working or not and make revisions as needed. And then, of course, what we emphasize, because of the simplicity of our language and models, you can share the models and language with stakeholders and colleagues in a way that diffuses this way of thinking in your organization or whoever it is you're working with. So this is how we apply it at a very high level. So that's kind of the overview. And this is a list I've never used or come up with before, but it's kind of an interesting one. I was playing with it just this morning. And I recognize that if you think about what those models and logic do for you, they do at least these things. They give you a way to define performance in a way that's measurable into well-defined elements. They give you also a way to connect people's behavior to results, because if you can tell people, I want you to produce this thing, this output, and here's the behavior you need for it. And by the way, this output is valuable because it contributes to business results. You can connect up people in their awareness and their commitment, if you will, to the results for the whole organization. The criteria that we mentioned for good outputs defines what good looks like, what the optimal, the best, what we need in terms of your outputs or your accomplishments. We can then use those outputs to identify what behavior is needed, and maybe what the superstars do, which we'll be talking about next month, the exemplary behavior needed to produce those accomplishments. We can discover sources of error. If we're doing things like process improvement and there's some defect, we can use the 6 boxes framework to do root cause analysis to figure out, like, what's going wrong? Why is it going wrong here? And what are the things that we could change? And then in a more positive design thinking way, we can not just figure out what's wrong, but we can identify opportunities for improvement to optimize the system for greater return on investment, for greater efficiency, et cetera. And that's the next one. Of course, we can optimize behavior influences. And then finally, as I mentioned, we can communicate, collaborate, and create communities of practice. So these are kind of the generic things that these 2 models and language allow us to do. And what we've learned, and a lot of it is because of the simplicity of it, is that basically anybody can use this. I mean, we've done executive coaching with very senior people in companies, CEOs and so forth, and they can understand their own performance and contributions and what might make a difference. We can work with, high school educated people on an assembly line, and they can get the language and begin to apply it. One of our colleagues, Gordy Anderson's been working with lean, teams in manufacturing environments for years, teaching kind of frontline workers to problem solve what's going on about performance, and everybody in between. Now, this is something that also just occurred to me. This actually is an old talk that I gave at a conference years ago. And if you're interested in it, you can use that QR code to get there, to get to the recording. But what I recognized was one of the reasons we're able to do what I'm about to unpack for you is because of the simplicity, the fact that there's 4 elements to performance, that there's 6 boxes, that it's plain English. It's very powerful and extremely flexible. And I think that allows us, as you'll see, to basically think about performance improvement with a set of templates. These 6 types of applications guides us toward how to do the analysis and design work. So let me tell you, and again, those of you who've been through our practitioner program, it used to be 5 types, and then I realized I had a duh moment in which I realized that sales process is not the same as other kinds of processes. But what we've recognized is that any project you do, and I coach dozens of projects, you know, I've coached hundreds of them by now of all kinds in different organizations, is that any given application or project you might do is either one of these types or sometimes it's a hybrid. So in the beginning, you know, the simple thing is looking at a role or a job title or an individual performer. Let's analyze the expectation we have of the customer service representative or the factory maintenance person, figure out what their outputs are, and then apply this whole logic to trying to optimize it. Or for coaching an individual, we can do the same thing with that individual. So that's the first type of application, defining and supporting a basically individual or role. And this is, again, what that looks like. You know, you start out with a customer diagram, or we used to call it that. We call it an individual performance map now. And the QR code that will point you to a webinar we did a few months ago with Therese Longo, whose consulting firm has really taken this and run with it to build job profiles. And you might find that fairly interesting if you didn't get, you know, see it before. So if we're defining and supporting a role or individual, what are the kinds of applications? What are some examples? Well, first of all, we can just build job profiles. And we can use them as a way to design jobs and to tweak those jobs as needed, and then to measure performance. So that's a starting place right there. And then we can also use those job profiles if we know what the outputs are of a given job. We can, in the hiring process, we can have behavioral interviews. Like, have you ever you know, created a strategic plan for your team, or you know, built a requirements document, or developed a problematic relationship, or, you know, in other words, what are the outputs that are important? Let's have a conversation about that. And what did you do? And what's your experience? So you can basically use the outputs to drive behavioral interviews, which I think are considered part of the gold standard for a good hiring process. You can also do performance tests. You can give people an example of a thing that they would need to produce, and you can say, can you improve this, or make me one, or whatever it is. So you can, in the hiring process, you can use these job profiles or these definitions of the outputs for a role in a very powerful way. You can then onboard people this way. You can say, what are the outputs that the individual, a new hire, needs to be up to speed on right off the bat, maybe things we hire them for already. And then in the first days, in the first week, in the first month, in the first 6 months, based on priority and frequency and so forth. So you can build onboarding by staging development of work outputs over time, and essentially have a criterion referenced onboarding process where you're pretty sure at each step people now can demonstrate the ability to produce those contributions. You can, of course, follow in Joe Harless's steps and do accomplishment-based curriculum design or training design, where instead of starting out with behavioral objectives, you start out with an output. I'm going to teach you to produce a budget the way we do it around here. I'm going to produce you to show you how to create this kind of code, or how to improve your relationship, or how to produce a, you know, proposal, or whatever the outputs are. The modular training, if you will, can be built around things that people actually need to produce on the job. And then you can coach people. Instead of coaching just their behavior, you can take our coaching methodology, the performance thinking coach, and you can actually define the outputs of the person you're coaching and be real clear with them on expectations, and then you can help to improve their performance one output at a time. And that QR code there is, let me move my head here, but that QR code is goes to the coaching program process. It's a short playlist. It's actually a single video, I believe, on sort of the rationale for accomplishment-based coaching. We can make decisions about promotion, compensation, and so forth. And a little bit later, I'll show you the larger model of accomplishment-based talent development we have. And you can measure talent development. You can count how many outputs your team has improved this month, this week, this quarter, whatever it is. You can look at the whole organization. So those are just some of the applications that fall out of the performance thinking approach for defining and supporting a role or individual. And this is actually the model I was going to mention to you. This is our accomplishment-based talent development model. And I just realized I do not have here, but if people are interested, we could send it to you. I recently was very excited because Talent Development, or TD Magazine, which is the primary publication of the Association for Talent Development, which is a giant organization for people in training and development world, just published an article by me called Accomplishment-Based Talent Development, which I'm excited about because I think it will gain some legitimacy, if you will, for this approach. But the QR code down there goes to a webinar we did on this topic a while ago. And the idea is, as you can see here, that at every stage in talent development, you can leverage the definition of outputs for that job to develop people, as well as measure, evaluate, make compensation decisions and so forth. So that's the first thing, a whole bunch of different ways you can use performance thinking for individual roles or job titles. The second thing is process. There are some process-specific methodologies out there, and I've worked with some of the best, places like Amgen and other companies where process improvement is a really important thing, and they have specialized Six Sigma folks and lean process improvement people. But we can add value there. Again, here's a simple example of a process. And one of the things we learned, basically there's two things we learned working with some very sophisticated process people who acknowledge this, that performance thinking adds. One of them is that most process people are very clear about what the final product of the process is. The final output of a process. And in fact, they use voice of the customer and other forms of sort of analysis and such to be sure that it meets requirements and all that. But many process people don't actually explicitly define the countable things produced by each step. And we kind of insist on that as a discipline. And I think in doing so, it allows you to diagnose where things go off the rails, if they do, where there are opportunities for improvement, where quality standards aren't quite being made in a more fine-grained way. So that's one thing, which the insistence on outputs at each step, at each bit of behavior. And then the second thing is, and this I learned from people over like the last 15 years, because they use the 6 boxes this way, instead of, if you have some problem with the humans, traditionally, a lot of process folks just kind of say, oh, that's human error. Well, that doesn't really solve anything. And I've joked about this with process professionals sometimes and said, well, you just kind of throw it in the human error bucket. How does that help? Well, instead, you can say, oh, the people didn't perform as expected. Let's look at the 6 boxes to do root cause analysis and design of a better. So those are two things that our approach really adds significant value. And so again, we can document the work outputs from each process step. That in its own way has values. That allows us to monitor and measure process performance in a little bit more fine-grained way. We can say, oh, this is where the output was not meeting criteria. So we can figure out where things happened that we need to change. And then when you do that, you can conduct root cause analysis using the 6 boxes and figure out how to optimize that performance and eliminate those defects. And then you can put together the best possible combination of behavior influences to really continuously improve process performance. And then, as for example, Gordy Anderson has done, you can teach teams of people who are executing processes how to apply performance thinking to sort of as they sometimes swarm. If there's a problem, if there's a defect, if something goes wrong on the assembly line, you pull the red cord, so to speak, stop the assembly line, and the team swarms and tries to problem solve it in real time. And this is very powerful for those kinds of teams, and it sort of ups the capabilities often of those teams. And so you can develop the process managers and the teams. And then, of course, you can use all of this to standardize processes so that, for example, if you're a growing behavioral health company or a startup that's growing rapidly, and all of a sudden you got a bunch of different locations or a bunch of programs, and you can't depend on what I sometimes call tribal knowledge, somebody who knows how to do this, all of a sudden, yeah, but we're in the Seattle area and we got another office in New York. How are we going to be sure the processes in New York are properly implemented? Well, if we use the elements of performance thinking, we can document them in such a way that it can be executed consistently. Okay, that's the second category. Third category is we talk about this third category in different ways, and I often say that this type of application is sort of for the benefit of the training and development people that I encounter, because frankly, probably 60% or more of the people who show up in our performance consulting certification program, our performance thinking practitioner program, come from the training and development world. They want to escape just being stuck in the training or skills and knowledge box. They want to have a bigger impact. And so sometimes we talk about this as making training stick or implementing training programs. But really the best way to think about it is, okay, maybe training is relevant here. But how are we going to be sure that what we teach people is actually sustained on the job? And how are we going to optimize the return on investment in terms of performance? So there's a bunch of things we can do, but these are three critical ones, I think. If we start out and instead of having behavioral objectives as what we're trying to set as expectations for a training program, we say this is an output that you, the trainee, will learn to produce to specification. That all of a sudden focuses people on things that they will also have to produce on the job, rather than competencies or skills and knowledge that they might apply in various ways. It makes it real concrete for the performer. It also makes it a lot easier to assess whether the person has met the objectives, because can they produce this widget, this document, this piece of machinery adjusted to spec, this relationship. So that's the first thing it does. It focuses on what people actually need to produce on the job. The second thing is, using the 6 boxes model, we can go outside just the skills and knowledge box and say, okay, but wait a minute, if this is going to get applied on the job, we need to have supervisors, especially for new employees, setting somewhat different expectations more clearly. And we're going to have them also have to partner with us to provide feedback. And we're going to be sure that the tools on the job actually work. That we don't have lousy software, that if possible, we make whatever the tools are work properly. And we're also going to want to arrange consequences, even if it's just good job, thank you, from the manager or supervisor. What we're doing is we're expanding our intervention into the full set of elements or functions defined by the 6 boxes, to be sure that it isn't just train, as they say, spray and pray, but actually we partner with the people who are managing and supervising and leading performance in the workplace to be sure all these things are in place. That's going to make it much more likely that you'll get a payoff. And then that really leads to the third thing here, that little phrase in the missing its quotation marks I see at the end, but adding the S to Addies came from our colleagues at Amgen, the biotech company, who some years ago presented at our annual summer institute that we used to run, in which they talked about ADDIE, which is a traditional acronym used in the training and development world of analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And they added sustainment. And what S for sustainment meant was, after you implement some intervention, they make an agreement with their stakeholders that we're going to come back 8 weeks later or whatever, some chunk of time after implementation, and we're going to do a quick and dirty sort of assessment about the 6 boxes, and we'll almost guaranteed discover some stuff we thought would work that didn't. And so what it means is that we'll have an explicit, agreed upon, maybe once, maybe repeatedly, opportunity to check and be sure the thing is working and improve it. And that's almost guaranteed to sustain whatever it was we trained them way back when. So these are things that training professionals, to the extent that they can partner with their stakeholders, can do based on performance thinking. Fourth kind, change management implementation planning. Now, I'm not sure, based on who's here, I'm not sure who of you have formal background in change management or implementation science, so-called. And there's a lot of good methods out there, everything from ProSci's ADKAR to others. But what I've noticed about the change management world in particular is that they're real good at communication plans. They're real good at identifying change agents and champions who will help support the change. And there's some other stuff that change management methodologies tend to be good at. But then a lot of them just have this box called reinforcement, which is what they mean is what you're supposed to do to be sure the change sustains. And I've always thought that was pretty weak, just in terms of how it's defined. It's kind of vague and generalized. So we explicitly, in our change management approach, we don't talk about that often, although there's a webinar there that you can check out if you are interested. The QR code will get you there. But we have what we sometimes call the 3 buckets approach to change management and implementation planning. And what we mean is there's 3 buckets of work outputs. So if you're trying to, let's say, implement some new procedure, that's fairly complex in your behavioral health organization or in your manufacturing organization or your shipping company or whatever it is, first of all, what are the outputs that you're expecting of the performers that need to perform? So we know what those outputs are. But then when we get to the behavior influences needed to support those outputs in the target audience, there's a second bucket, which is the behavior influences that managers, leaders, and departments need to produce to support the target performers. So they need to have clear expectations. They need to have feedbacks. They may need to put in place a new tool. We may need to help the VP write her letter that gets communicated to everybody so that it really sets expectations. In other words, if we're going to do this for real, we don't want to just sort of say, oh, these are the things we're going to put in place. We want to be sure that those behavior influences actually are put in place. And those behavior influences are work outputs of other people typically. So that's the second bucket. And then the third bucket, which is often relevant, is if you've got a complex thing that you're implementing or changing, there may be a series of milestones in that rollout process. And so that's another set of outputs to look at and to support. So the point is here that we think we have a very systematic approach, which doesn't just say, okay, this is the change, we're going to train them and put some people out there who are change agents and stuff. We're going to take that word reinforcement, as is used by these folks, not in the same way the behaviorists do, but we're going to make sense out of it. We're going to say, wait a minute, we need to be sure that the influencers on the target performers actually put in place what they need, which are their outputs. And then we're going to be sure when we look at the rollout that we've planned for that as well. So that's our additional sort of strength, we think, to implementation planning and change management that performance thinking offers. And so we focus on the performance of the people. That's another thing I didn't say, actually. A lot of people in implementation planning and change management, especially when it comes to computer systems, say, we're going to implement, whatever it is, some new system, and central reach for our behavioral health company. Well, actually, you're not, we hope, implementing the system only. What you're doing is you have business or clinical or other processes that you need to implement and you need to get people to execute. And these systems ought to be the tools and resources needed to support that performance. And this is an important distinction because people fall into this thing of we're going to implement the new system. And the trouble is, a lot of times, as some of you maybe have experienced, people then stuff their business or clinical or other processes into the systems in a way that don't always work that way. In fact, I was really happy yesterday. I was coaching a project with a woman who was talking about system implementation. I said, wait a minute, how are you doing this? And she said, oh no, we're defining the process first, and then we're being sure that the system is able to support what we need instead of kind of cramming our processes into a system in a way that distorts it. So that's an important thing in its own right. We're talking about defining the performance first, and then we got a box for the system, which is box 2. And then the second thing is, as I already mentioned, is by looking outside of just box 4, skills and knowledge, we can be sure to put in place what so-called reinforcement actually means to ensure sustainment. And then we also, the third thing is, once we define those things, we can be darn sure that the people who are supposed to produce those behavior influences do so by arranging conditions to support their performance, behavior influences. Now, in the webinar that we devoted to this some years ago, we talk about, because I used to be a philosopher, I was almost a philosophy PhD before I got into behavior science. And my joke was, we manage all the way up to God. The reason is because God is defined in traditional philosophy as the uncaused cause. So everybody else's performance or behavior is caused by the behavior influences we put in place. So we want to be sure, as high as we need to go in that hierarchy or that system, we've locked it down so that it actually happens as planned. So that's the change management and implementation planning kind of applications. The cultural values thing is different, and that came up a few years ago, and some of you may know about how we think about this. But the reason it came up was, my observation always has been that everybody talks about culture, but nobody has much that's very actionable about it. Whether it's academic, high-end discussion about all the meta-contingencies that affect performers, or whether it's in big organizations where senior executives deliver some message and they put posters on the wall, and when they see people who did a good job, they say, hey, they really lived the practice. I was working with the teams of people, senior managers in a Korean company, big Korean company, and it was GS Caltex, actually, it's a big petroleum company, and we were doing management development for them, and they were talking about some big culture change they were trying to make in their organization. And the big aha that I had in that context, this is like almost 10 years ago now, I think, but was that the practice of a given value looks different in different jobs or different departments. So things like diversity, equity, inclusion probably looks different in HR than it does in IT and customer service and whatever. Or focus on the customer probably looks very different in customer service than in product development. There are actually different things we produce and do to align with those values. So if you have a generic notion of what the values and practices are, it's not very likely to be implemented in all the specific ways it needs to be. So the article, the QR code points to this article that I published, kind of a slightly nerdy, but I think somewhat different academic article in Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, is a bottoms-up approach. What it says is, first of all, we got some value statements around here. The things that are on the wall or in the executive's presentation, whatever. They're value statements that are supposed to lead to certain practices. But because those practices might vary, we start with the work outputs, and with the individuals or within the processes or within the teams. What do they need to produce? And then we look at those outputs and we say, to which of those outputs does this value even apply? Because some of them it's not going to have any relationship to. But the ones where it does, if there's a good chance that if we practice that value, it will change the criteria for what a good instance of that output is. For example, a hiring decision within DEI, or the assembled team to do the hiring, if diversity, equity, inclusion is a set of cultural values, well, we want to be sure that the decision takes into account a broader range of applicants than it might have normally in the past. We want to be sure that the hiring team configuration isn't just a bunch of white guys, that we have a variety of people that represent the kind of diversity we want in our organization, et cetera. And so once we've done that, we look at those outputs and we say, how do the criteria for good one change based on this value? And then let's redefine expectations for what those work outputs and the behavior needed to produce them is supposed to be. And if we teach supervisors, leaders, and managers to think this way, they will be able to work with their teams, with the processes within their scope, et cetera, to define what the practice of that value looks like in their context. And they'll be role specific. And we've not had I've done a couple of projects with this, one with some folks at FedEx and a couple of others. But this is one of those things, again, everybody talks about, nobody does much about. But the leverage here is, I think, the traction that's possible, depending on how well you develop your supervisors, managers, leaders, et cetera, in thinking this way, is pretty powerful. And it comes straight out of the performance thinking models. And then finally, sales performance. And this has a sort of a funny background, almost as a joke, because I started out my career in organizational performance improvement in sales performance back in 1982, 83. And this is when one of my mentors, Og Lindsley, told me he wanted me to get out of the education world, so where we doing so-called precision teaching, and apply what we learned from precision teaching in the corporate world. And I didn't know what that meant, really. But I discovered the area of sales performance and have been involved with it on and off for about 40 years. And yet I didn't think about adding this as a separate category. But notice, people talk about processes in organizations, and usually what they mean is fairly well-defined sequential steps, each of which depends on the previous one and leads to the next one. And it's a fairly strict sequence of outputs and decisions. But in sales performance, it's a little bit different. So here's an example that you probably can't see very well on your screen. But this is an example of the milestones or accomplishments, or salespeople would call them advances, for one particular sales force in a medical devices organization and one of their product lines. So what you can see is that it's not like all sequential, it's different parts of their work. So if they're strategizing, prioritizing, and planning how they're going to go about their week or their month or approach their territories, there's a bunch of outputs in there. If they are looking at inventory of the product from their company that's in place in their client organizations, there's some outputs there, like up-to-date inventory summaries, right inventory in each materials room, right trunk stock inventory, which means the stuff they carry around in their car so they can have it available if the doctors need it. Then there's case plans and successful cases. Again, you may not be able to read this, but this is a lot of little outputs. And they're not strictly sequential, even though many of them depend on each other. So the way you do this is you don't do a process map. You talk to salespeople in a given organization, and first you identify what the areas of their performance are, those kind of the headings that are in this list. And then you interview people and you say, okay, when you're strategizing and prioritizing and planning, what are the things you produce? What are the things you're trying to get to as part of that? And they'll tell you about behavior, but you can capture from that what the behavior produces, the outputs. And so it's a different approach to capturing outputs. And so for that reason, it's a sixth category. It's not the same as you do it in the other 5 categories. In fact, in our practitioner program, we have an appendix in our book which talks about how for each of these 6 types of applications, you go about gathering the outputs. So if you're doing sales performance enablement, first of all, you can document all the large and small milestones, or what salespeople will call advances, that successful sales reps achieve as they move toward closing business. And then you can identify the behavior or the exemplary strategies and tactics that the real superstars used to achieve those milestones at exceptional levels. And that often is an example of exemplary behavior analysis. Again, we'll be talking about that next month. And then you can be sure to put all the behavior influences in place from all the different departments and functions that support performance to consistently and cost effectively support the sales performance, achieving the milestones, and you use the 6 boxes for that. So these are critical things which most people who do sales enablement don't do and don't have tools for. So one of the implications of all of this is that there's a lot of different users, potentially. Now, we've worked mostly with learning and performance people. We've worked with managers of small and medium-sized companies and supervisors. We've worked with some talent management folks. We've done little bits of leadership development in certain companies, et cetera. And we've worked with all these different kinds of folks at different points over the last 35 years. But the point is, not only can these different functions benefit from performance thinking and all the applications, but also they can collaborate. they can potentially not be using separate vocabularies and live in separate silos. This is actually a thing which is probably unreadable to you unless you have a big screen. But when we first started out this thing, we sort of developed these performance thinking models in the early 80s. And in sort of once it was about 90 something, we kind of had it fairly well defined. And what we recognized was that we could think about applications times users. And so we originally set out to have actual modules and training programs for all these different players listed across the top to do all these different things, because many of them do versions of the same thing. So I'm not going to bore you with these details, but that's kind of what we're talking about here today. This is a Swiss Army knife for a lot of different people. And then there's just one other thing that I've talked about a lot, but I wanted to emphasize, because throughout all these applications, they involve people, and they involve people working in organizations. And so employee engagement, having people not just be productive, but happy and engaged and ready to go to work and exhibiting discretionary effort, is kind of an overriding purpose for all of that. So, the Gallup organization, which has been doing an employee engagement survey for several decades, and there's been a lot of research done on it, one of the things that those research reports almost always say is, in the end, as an employee, you may work for ABC company, but you're really working for your manager. Your manager is who controls almost all of the conditions under which you work. And so we've always framed that like this. We've said that the job of a leader or manager is not necessarily to be the smartest person on the team, although that's helpful sometimes, but it's primarily to arrange behavior influences indicated by the 6 boxes there so that their people will be both productive and engaged. So if you start with that in mind, and then you ask groups, which we did for some years, like, what are some of the kinds of things that leaders do? And so you get stuff like on that flip chart. Or what are the kinds of things that managers do? And you get more stuff. And then you say, wait a minute, those are almost all about arranging behavior influences. So that's very interesting. And then you say, let's take a look at the Gallup 12 Employee Engagement Survey. And the reason it's interesting to me, first of all, it's simple. There's 12 items. And what you do as an employee, if you're given this survey, is you rate the extent to which it's true, not at all being 1 and a whole bunch being 5. I know what is expected of me at work. I have the materials and equipment I need, blah, blah, blah. Now, 2 things about that. First thing is, a lot of research has been done to show that organizations that score with a lot of 5s across their employee base on that survey, this is real bottom line stuff. They have lower turnover. They have much better safety. They have fewer product defects. They have higher productivity in product. These are things that attract executive attention, And but the other thing that's very interesting about it, and I remember when this hit me like a truck, is that those questions sort into the 6 boxes model. And you can think about different ways of sorting them, but this is a pretty decent sort of those Gallup 12. And if we expand, this is like what my reaction was, like, oh my gosh, I never saw it that way. And if you expand that to include all those things that leaders and managers do, you can get this framework, which is something we've been working with for a few years now, that we think of as best practices for leaders, managers, and performance professionals. In other words, this is not a list of 6, a set of 6 lists. These are all the things which, if you do, aligned with the Gallup poll, as well as what we know of the 6 boxes, if you do these things and they're aligned and positive, you're going to get productive and happy campers. And so in our practitioner program, which if you want to know more about it, and we've got a group coming up in a few weeks, and there's still a little bit of time to sign up. So I would love it if we had a few new people in this group. But in our practitioner program, we talk about this a bit, and you can get to the homepage there. In our performance coaching program, which we kind of hit a wall during COVID, because all of a sudden people weren't meeting together anymore, and our program was built around talking to people across the desk or the table. So we've made it all virtual now, but we're now looking for organizations that are interested in piloting it. But same deal, in that program, we emphasize this thing about engagement. But one of the things we've learned about from all these webinars is we have applications where you don't have to learn everything there is to know about performance thinking. We can provide templates. And so the first one we're going to do, and we're hoping this quarter over the next several months to really put it together and pilot it. We've piloted a non-digital version of it. I did this this little mini program for a group of about 60 leaders online a few months ago, and they loved it. And what it's about is taking those best practices that I just showed you and sharing them among people, learning with and from one another, and using it as a foundation for continuous leadership development. And our plan is to build application kits, which will be digital tools, PDF type worksheets and such, with short instructional videos focused on a very particular kind of application of the kinds we've been talking about, and very inexpensive, well under $100 a participant to buy, online. So that's our plan. And if you want to get on the mailing list to know about those, you can point your phone at that. So that's my story. It's just an hour, but I don't know if anybody, I'm happy to stick around. I wonder if there are questions, comments, or observations about any of this. And you can use the chat box if you'd like. I just see a few commentators here. What do you think? I guess one question I have for you is, part of the reason that I plan to do this thing is because we've done all these, webinars on specific applications. So people say, oh, that's an interesting one, that's an interesting one. And a lot of you and others have made contact with this work through various applications. But I wanted to get real clear, like, you learn this framework, this way of thinking, and there's a lot of stuff you can do. Thank you, Erwin. Appreciate your presence. Anybody else? Because we can certainly just finish up, but I wondered if anybody has any other comments. Okay, well, in which case, then, we'll end it here. I appreciate your participation and your presence, and this will be on YouTube in a couple of days, and we'll take it from there. So thank you.